On a Tuesday morning in March, while most of the world was watching trade war theater play out on television screens, something far more consequential was unfolding behind closed doors in Beijing. A single document, a table, two delegations, and a decision that would quietly redraw the map of global power before anyone outside that room even knew a meeting had taken place. If you're new here, subscribe and hit the bell. What you're about to hear is the kind of story that rarely makes the headlines, but shapes everything underneath them. The date was March 14th. The location, the Great Hall of the People. A senior Chinese trade official slid a document across a table to a Canadian delegation that had been inside the building for less than 2 hours. Thousands of miles away in Ottawa, the clock read 10:47 in the evening when Mark Carney picked up a secure line. His trade minister was in the room. So was his national security advisor. The call lasted 34 minutes. When it ended, Carney asked for the document to be printed. He read it once. Then he said 3 words: "Get it done." Washington had no idea any of this was happening, not because the information had been deliberately hidden, but because the assumption inside the White House had always been that China would never extend this category of offer to Canada. Beijing, in American strategic thinking, reserved its deepest economic arrangements for partners it considered strategically essential. Canada, nestled inside the American framework, was viewed as a junior partner, not an independent actor capable of drawing this level of focused attention from Beijing on its own terms. That assumption was wrong. The document on that table was the proof. China had just offered Canada something it had never formally offered the United States, and Canada had just accepted. To understand why this moment was extraordinary, you have to understand how Beijing actually structures its most important economic relationships, because China does not treat all trade partnerships the same way, and it never has. At the most basic tier sit the standard trade relationships: goods flowing, tariffs negotiated, companies investing. These are transactional by nature, present in nearly every major economy on Earth, and they carry no particular strategic weight beyond the raw numbers. Above that sits what Beijing internally describes as comprehensive strategic partnerships. These go far beyond simple commerce. They involve coordinated policy alignment, technology cooperation, infrastructure investment, and a level of access to Chinese industrial systems that standard partners never receive. China manages these relationships carefully, and the countries inside them receive treatment the countries outside them simply do not. But above even that level exists a third category, one that almost no Western nation has ever been offered, a category built around what Beijing considers its most sensitive and powerful strategic asset: preferential access to critical mineral processing infrastructure, rare earth supply chains, and next generation clean energy technology that China has spent 2 decades and hundreds of billions of dollars building into a position of near total global dominance. The scale of that dominance is worth pausing on. China controls approximately 60% of the world's rare earth mining and more than 85% of the world's rare earth processing capacity. It commands the global supply chain for the materials required to manufacture electric vehicle batteries, advanced semiconductors, military-grade electronics, and next-generation clean energy systems. No other country is remotely close. For years, Washington attempted to negotiate access to that processing infrastructure. Those conversations led nowhere. Beijing had no interest in handing the United States preferential access to the very technology and supply chains that represented China's primary strategic leverage over the Western industrial world. Offering America that access would have been the geopolitical equivalent of surrendering your most powerful card in the middle of the game. What China offered Canada on March 14th was something structurally different: a joint framework for developing rare earth processing technology on Canadian soil, combining Canadian raw materials with Chinese industrial knowledge inside a governance structure that gave Ottawa meaningful control over the output. Not absolute control, but meaningful control. Enough to matter strategically, enough to make this offer categorically unlike anything Beijing had ever placed in front of an American negotiator. The logic behind why China chose Canada rather than any other country is not complicated once you stop viewing the world through Washington's assumptions. Beijing has no interest in strengthening its primary geopolitical rival, but it has every interest in steadily eroding the architecture of American led economic dominance that it views as its central long term obstacle. Every time a country the United States considers firmly inside its orbit makes an independent economic decision of genuine strategic weight, it weakens, slightly but durably, the assumption that Washington controls the choices of its closest partners. Canada was not a random selection, it was a deliberate one. Resource rich, technologically capable, increasingly impatient with American economic pressure, and led by a prime minister whose background in global finance gave him both the sophistication to evaluate an offer of this complexity and the political discipline not to flinch from it. The groundwork for March 14th had been laid months earlier during Carney's January visit to Beijing, the first by a Canadian prime minister to China in nearly a decade. Most coverage treated it as a diplomatic reset, a goodwill gesture, a signal that Ottawa wanted to diversify trade relationships without committing to anything concrete. That reading wasn't wrong, but it was incomplete, because alongside the state banquets and carefully choreographed photo opportunities, a separate set of conversations was happening in rooms no camera ever entered. Canadian officials were meeting behind closed doors with counterparts from China's Ministry of Commerce, the National Development and Reform Commission, and representatives of three state-owned enterprises directly involved in rare earth processing and clean energy technology development. Both sides were testing each other. China was gauging whether Canada had the political will to pursue an agreement Washington would view as a direct challenge to American supply chain strategy. Canada was assessing whether Beijing was genuinely prepared to put something substantive on the table, or whether this was another round of diplomatic signaling with nothing real attached. By February, Ottawa had its answer. A Chinese technical delegation arrived quietly, no press release, no public announcement, and spent 4 days in meetings with Canadian officials from Natural Resources Canada, the Department of Innovation, and a newly created Critical Minerals Strategic Office that Carney had established in his very first month as Prime Minister. What the delegation brought was not a rough proposal, it was a detailed, technically specific framework, structured in a way that immediately told every Canadian official in the room that this had not been assembled in a hurry. The level of precision involved suggested preparation that had been underway for months, possibly longer. Beijing had been building this offer carefully. Canada was not an improvised target, it was a chosen one. The framework covered three interconnected areas. First, a joint processing facility to be constructed in northern Ontario, drawing on Canadian lithium, cobalt, and rare earth deposits and combining them with Chinese processing expertise. Second, a technology transfer arrangement covering specific stages of battery cathode manufacturing, knowledge China had never formally shared with any Western partner. Third, a preferential supply agreement guaranteeing Canada priority access to processed rare earth materials for its domestic manufacturing sector across a 15-year window. Each of these elements, taken alone, would have been significant. Together, they represented something Canada's critical minerals industry had never possessed, a credible, realistic path toward processing independence that did not require building an entirely new industrial base from scratch over 2 decades of effort and uncertainty. When the Canadian delegation arrived in Beijing on March 14th, the document waiting on that table was the formalized version of everything February's framework had outlined: refined, legally structured, and ready not for signing, but for a decision. Both sides understood that formal ratification would require time and careful navigation of domestic political pressures on each side. But a decision in principle, yes or no, was what the moment demanded. Carney said yes at 10:47 in the evening, Ottawa time. The Great Hall of the People was already moving to its next meeting before the call had even ended. Washington did not learn about the framework agreement through any official Canadian communication. It learned through its own intelligence channels approximately 36 hours after Carney's call ended. The initial assessment that reached the National Security Council used measured, careful language, a preliminary framework details still unclear, formal ratification uncertain. But underneath that measured language, the implications were understood immediately, because the specific elements of the framework, rare earth processing, battery cathode technology, 15-year supply guarantees, touched directly on three separate American strategic priorities that had been formally designated as critical national security concerns in the most recent National Defense Industrial Strategy. The United States had spent years constructing alternative rare earth processing capacity outside China. It had invested billions in domestic mining initiatives, offered incentives to allied nations to develop processing infrastructure, and designed the Inflation Reduction Act specifically to reward North American critical mineral supply chains. The entire architecture of that strategy rested on a foundational assumption that Canada was a reliable partner operating inside a North American supply chain framework, not an independent actor capable of negotiating bilateral arrangements with Beijing that created parallel supply chains beyond American oversight. The phone call from Washington to Ottawa came within 48 hours. Those familiar with the conversation described it as direct. American officials wanted to understand what Canada had agreed to, whether it was binding, and what it meant for existing North American critical mineral cooperation frameworks. Ottawa's response was equally direct. Canada had agreed to a preliminary framework. The details were still being worked through, and Canada's decisions about its own resource development and industrial policy were sovereign decisions that Ottawa would make based on Canadian national interests, in consultation with allies where appropriate, but not subject to American veto. That final phrase landed with particular weight, not because it was hostile, not because it was aggressive, but because it was calm. It was simply a statement of fact, delivered without apology by a government that had clearly decided it was prepared to say it out loud. Washington had no immediate counter available. Sanctioning Canada was not a realistic option. Threatening further tariff escalation on top of existing tensions carried its own steep political costs. And publicly condemning a close ally for making an economic agreement with a third country, however strategically uncomfortable, would have put Washington in a position impossible to defend in front of every other American ally, quietly watching how the situation was handled. So Washington said very little. And in that silence, the signal became louder than any statement could have been. Here is the part that almost no analysis has properly connected. The Canada-China Rare Earth Framework is not primarily a story about minerals. It is a story about what happens when the assumption of automatic allied alignment breaks down in a specific, measurable, economically concrete way. For decades, Western economic strategy has rested on assumptions so broadly shared they were rarely examined directly. One of those assumptions was that Canada's resource sector was effectively an integrated component of the North American economic system, available to American industrial policy as a dependable input, governed by trade architecture designed around Washington's interests and unlikely to make independent strategic decisions that conflicted with American supply chain priorities. What happened on March 14th breaks that assumption in a specific and durable way. Not because Canada is abandoning the Western alliance, it is not. Not because Carney has concluded that Beijing is a more important partner than Washington, he has not, but because Ottawa has demonstrated that it is capable of making economically significant decisions in service of Canadian interests, even when those decisions generate friction with American strategic preferences. And that demonstration matters enormously, not just for Canada, but for every resource-rich middle power watching how this unfolds. Australia has rare earths. Chile has lithium. Indonesia has nickel. All of them have been receiving similar approaches from Beijing for years. All of them have been hesitating because the prevailing assumption was that Washington's reaction would make the cost prohibitively high. Canada just changed that calculation. If a country as deeply integrated with the United States as Canada can say yes to a Beijing framework agreement and absorb Washington's response without suffering catastrophic consequences, then the threshold for every other middle power has just shifted. The cost of accepting a Chinese offer dropped. The assumption of automatic and devastating American reaction weakened. and Beijing's ability to extend these agreements and have them accepted just increased. That is the strategic multiplier effect concealed beneath the headlines about minerals and processing facilities. One agreement in Northern Ontario will not single-handedly reshape the global rare earth industry. But the precedent it establishes that a close American ally can make independent strategic economic decisions involving China without being effectively punished for it ripples outward in ways that become very difficult to contain once they begin moving. Carney almost certainly understood this when he said those three words. The formal ratification of the Canada-China Critical Minerals Framework still has several stages ahead of it. Regulatory processes, environmental assessments, community consultations, parliamentary scrutiny. This is not a story about a facility that materialized overnight, but the decision has been made. And in geopolitics, the decision is almost always more consequential than the implementation, because the decision reveals what the decision maker actually believes, what they are genuinely prepared to do, and where the real boundaries of their independence sit, as opposed to where everyone had assumed those boundaries sat. What follows from here is a cascade of secondary consequences, unfolding gradually but in directions that are now largely predictable. Other nations will begin testing whether what Canada did is replicable for them. Beijing will receive intensified interest from resource-rich middle powers that previously held back. Washington will find itself facing simultaneous pressure from more partners at once rather than managing each situation in isolation. Inside Canada, the domestic political debate will sharpen. Not every province, not every industry, and not every political voice will support what Carney has agreed to. Opposition forces will frame the arrangement as a security risk. Some allies will express discomfort through private diplomatic channels. The long-building debate about Canada's relationship with China will move from the margins to the center of Canadian political life. And in the long run, if the Northern Ontario processing facility is built, it will represent something Canada has never before possessed, an industrial anchor in the critical minerals sector that carries no dependence on American markets, American technology, or American political goodwill, a facility that gives Ottawa genuine leverage in conversations it currently enters without any. And leverage, real leverage, changes what a country is, not dramatically, not overnight, but structurally in ways that compound across time. A Canada with independent rare earth processing capacity is a fundamentally different negotiating partner than a Canada without it. It has options it did not previously have. And options in international relations are the only form of power that reliably outlasts changing political seasons. On the morning of March 14th, while a political performance about tariffs played out under bright television lights, the most consequential economic decision Canada had made in a generation was already moving forward in a room that performance had no idea existed. That is the difference between spectacle and strategy. One needs cameras, the other needs a secure phone line, a printed document, and 3 words spoken quietly at 10:47 in the evening in a city already deep in sleep. China offered Canada what it never offered America. Canada said yes. Washington found out 36 hours later through its own intelligence services. This was never a trade story. It was always a power story. And power, once it begins to shift, rarely finds its way back. If this kind of analysis is what you come here for, share this video, leave a comment with your take, and subscribe, because the stories that actually move the world are rarely the ones dominating the front page. And this is exactly the kind of reporting we're committed to bringing you every single week.